It was a warm summer evening in the small town of Hillcrest, a suburban neighborhood where nothing much ever happened. The lawns were neatly trimmed, and the houses were cozy, surrounded by tall trees that lined the streets like silent sentinels. The Langford family had just moved in a year ago, and they seemed to fit right in. Two kids, a dog, and a home that was always filled with laughter. The Langfords were known as a perfect family, the type of family you would find on the cover of a magazine. But all of that was about to change on one fateful night. Holly, a 16-year-old high school junior, had been babysitting for the Langfords for the past few months. She was smart, attractive, and eager to make some extra money for herself. The Langfords were kind and generous people, and they trusted her to take care of their children whenever they went out. Holly was also friendly with the couple, Susan and Tom Langford, and had always found Tom to be charming and kind. But lately, something had felt off. There was an underlying tension, something Holly couldn't quite put her finger on. It started with small gestures. Tom would linger a little too long when talking to her, making her feel uncomfortable, but not enough to make her say anything. At first, she told herself she was imagining things, but as time went on, the behavior escalated. Tom would offer compliments that felt more personal than friendly, and she could tell by the way he looked at her that his intentions were not innocent. Holly was confused, unsure of how to react, especially since Tom was married to Susan, a woman who seemed completely unaware of her husband's behavior. That night, Holly was staying over at the Langford's house to babysit while they went out to a fancy dinner. She had taken care of their two kids countless times before, but something about this night felt different. Tom had been acting strangely all week, and Holly couldn't shake the feeling that tonight would be no different. Around 7 p.m., Susan and Tom left for their dinner date, leaving Holly with the kids. It was a quiet evening at first. Holly had prepared dinner for the children, put them to bed, and was now watching TV in the living room, trying to distract herself from the gnawing unease that had settled in her stomach. But then there was a knock at the door. Holly froze. She wasn't expecting anyone, and the kids were already asleep. Who could it be? The last thing she wanted was to be disturbed, but the knock was insistent, so she got up and opened the door. Tom Langford was standing on the other side, his face a mixture of urgency and hesitation. He was dressed casually in a button-down shirt and khakis, clearly not on his way to a business meeting or work event. Holly's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected him to come back so soon. "Tom, is everything okay?" she asked, trying to mask the nervousness in her voice. Tom looked around, making sure no one was watching, before stepping inside. "I forgot something," he said, his tone low, almost whispering. "I thought it would be easier to just come back and grab it than call." Holly felt a knot tighten in her stomach, but she tried to brush it off as a simple mistake. "Okay, sure. What did you forget?" Tom closed the door behind him, his movements deliberate. "I just need to grab a file from the office. It'll only take a minute." Holly nodded, though she wasn't entirely convinced. Why didn't he just wait until the morning? Why had he come back for something so trivial? She couldn't help but feel that this was more than just a simple visit. Tom walked past her and down the hallway, and Holly followed him reluctantly. As he entered the office, Holly stayed in the doorway, feeling oddly uncomfortable. Something about his presence in the house, his closeness to her, felt different tonight. She had always felt safe before, but now with him so near, she felt exposed. He turned to face her as he opened a drawer. "I'm sorry for bothering you like this," he said, his voice smooth and almost soothing. "I didn't want to interrupt your evening." Holly forced a smile, trying to ignore the fluttering feeling in her chest. "It's fine, really." As Tom grabbed a manila envelope from the drawer, he walked closer to her, his eyes locking onto hers. Holly felt a surge of discomfort, but she couldn't move. She was frozen, caught in the intensity of his gaze. "You know," Tom said, his voice dropping lower. "You're looking beautiful tonight, Holly." Holly's heart raced. She couldn't breathe. This wasn't the man she had known for the past few months. This was someone else, someone dangerous. Before she could respond, Tom reached out, gently brushing his fingers against her arm. Holly recoiled, but it was too late. The moment lingered. Tom's fingers lingered for just a second too long. Holly's mind raced. What was happening? Was he really doing this? Was he trying to seduce her? The weight of the situation hit her all at once. The evening had begun like any other at the Langford house. Holly had spent a quiet night with the children after Tom and Susan left for their dinner. She had no idea that in just a few hours, the night would descend into chaos. As the sirens grew louder, Holly's heart began to race. She couldn't shake the image of Tom standing in the doorway, his hand lingering on her arm, his eyes dark and unsettling. Had he done something to Susan, to the kids, or was he planning something worse? She had just hung up the phone with Susan, who had sounded far too calm for someone whose husband had just come back home after a bizarre visit. There was something off about the way Susan had spoken. It didn't make sense. The sound of approaching sirens echoed through the quiet street, and Holly's hands began to shake. She stared at the phone, unsure whether she should call the police. What would she say? That Tom had tried to make advances on her? That he was acting suspiciously? Would anyone even believe her? Before Holly could make up her mind, the front door flew open and Tom Langford stumbled inside, his face pale, eyes wild. His shirt was wrinkled and his hair was disheveled as if he had been running. His hands were trembling. "Holly, I need your help," Tom gasped, his voice strained. Holly froze. Her mind screamed at her to run, to get away from this man who was clearly unraveling. But part of her was still in shock, unsure of what exactly was happening. "Tom, what? What's going on?" Holly stammered, her voice shaking. Tom walked into the living room, his steps quick and uneven. He barely looked at her as he paced around the room. His breathing was shallow, erratic. Holly could see the desperation in his eyes. I didn't mean for this to happen," he muttered, his hands running through his hair. "I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt." Holly's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? What happened?" Tom stopped pacing and turned to her, his face twisted with guilt and fear. "I didn't think it would go this far, but now she's dead." Holly's stomach lurched, and her breath caught in her throat. "Who's dead?" "Tom, what are you talking about?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, his eyes seemed to focus on some distant memory, as if he were struggling to come to terms with the gravity of what he had just done. Then slowly he turned to face her. "Susan," he whispered, "I didn't mean to do it, Holly. I swear to God I didn't." Holly's head spun. She couldn't process his words. What did he mean by that? Susan was supposed to be out at dinner. Was she home already? Had something happened? "Where is she?" Holly asked, her voice trembling with fear. Tom's expression twisted with panic. I don't know. She's upstairs. I didn't mean for it to go this far, but she found out about us." Holly felt a chill run down her spine. "About us?" she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. You mean what happened earlier?" Tom nodded, his face pale, his hands trembling uncontrollably. "She found out I tried to make things right, but she didn't want to listen. She was furious and I lost control." Holly's mind raced, but before she could react, there was a sudden noise from upstairs. Loud, frantic footsteps, a door opening and closing, followed by the sound of a muffled scream. "Oh, God," Holly whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. "What did you do?" Tom didn't answer. Instead, he darted toward the staircase, his eyes wild with fear. Holly didn't know what to do. She had been standing in the living room, frozen in shock. But now the reality of the situation was settling in. There was blood on his hands, and she didn't know if she could escape it. Holly followed him upstairs, her heart in her throat. When she reached the top of the stairs, Tom was already standing in front of the master bedroom, his back to her. He didn't turn around as she approached, but she could see his shoulders shaking. "Tom," Holly whispered, her voice cracking. What happened?" He slowly turned to face her, his eyes wide, his expression broken. I didn't want to hurt her. I didn't want any of this. But she was going to ruin everything. She was going to tell everyone what happened. What we did. I couldn't let her." Holly's stomach twisted. You killed her?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Tom nodded, his face pale, his lips trembling. "I didn't mean for it to happen. It just happened." Holly's breath quickened as she realized the gravity of the situation. Tom had killed his wife, and now everything was unraveling. There was no turning back. "Tom, we need to call the police," Holly said, her voice shaky. "We need to get help." But Tom shook his head, his eyes wild. No, we can't. If the police come, everything will fall apart. They'll find out what happened between us, Holly. They'll never believe you." Holly felt trapped, unsure of what to do. She had never imagined that a simple babysitting job could spiral so out of control. Detective Rachel Adams had seen her fair share of murders. Hillcrest was a quiet town, and it didn't often make headlines. But when something as horrific as the Langford family tragedy occurred, it sent ripples through the community. The small suburban neighborhood was about to be torn apart, and the case was about to become her most difficult investigation yet. It all started when the police received the emergency call. The Langford house, which had always appeared pristine and picture-perfect, was now the scene of a grisly murder. When Rachel arrived at the scene, the flashing lights of police cars lit up the street and an air of quiet urgency hung in the air. Neighbors had gathered outside, talking in hushed tones, unsure of what had transpired behind the closed doors of the Langford residence. As she stepped out of her car and made her way toward the front door, Rachel surveyed the scene with a practiced eye. She could already tell this was going to be a complicated one. There was no sign of forced entry, and everything appeared too clean, too well kept. And yet there was something distinctly off about the house. The officers had already taped off the area, ensuring no one entered the house without proper clearance. As she made her way inside, the faint scent of something metallic filled her nostrils. Blood. Rachel had dealt with enough violent crimes to recognize it right away. Upstairs in the master bedroom, Susan Langford's body lay sprawled on the floor, her once immaculate clothes stained with blood. She had been stabbed multiple times, each wound deep and deliberate, the kind of violence that told a story of rage and betrayal. Rachel immediately noticed the disturbed furniture, overturned chairs, broken picture frames. This wasn't just a murder, it looked like a struggle had taken place. Susan's body was found near the bed, but from the disarray it was clear she hadn't died quietly. There had been a fight. "What do we know so far?" Rachel asked, turning to the uniformed officer who had been securing the crime scene. "Not much, Detective," the officer replied, his face grim. "Tom Langford was the one who called it in. He said he found her like this when he returned home. He was clearly shaken, but his story seems off." Rachel raised an eyebrow. She had been in this business long enough to know when someone's story didn't add up. She stepped closer to the body, examining Susan Langford's wounds. There was no sign of a robbery. Everything valuable seemed to be in place. No forced entry. The family dog was nowhere to be seen, though. That was strange. Rachel needed answers, but she also knew that the best way to get them was to listen. As the crime scene investigators took photos and collected evidence, Rachel moved to speak with Tom Langford, the man who had found his wife's body. Tom was sitting in the living room when Rachel entered, his face pale, his hands shaking as he nervously fidgeted with his wedding ring. He looked every bit the grieving husband, lost, devastated, almost too perfect, too composed for someone who had just discovered his wife's brutal murder. "Mr. Langford," Rachel said, her voice steady but soft, trying to gauge his reaction. "I understand this is a difficult time for you, but I need you to answer some questions about what happened." Tom looked up, his eyes filled with genuine sorrow. "Detective, I don't know what happened. We were supposed to have a nice dinner, and when we got home I found Susan. I couldn't believe it." Rachel sat down across from him, watching his every move, his every word. "You didn't see anyone else at the house? No signs of a struggle before you found her?" Tom swallowed hard, his face contorting with a mixture of fear and confusion. "I came inside, and I didn't see anyone. I went upstairs to check on Susan, and that's when I found her." Rachel paused. There was something off about his reaction. He was too calm. He was saying all the right things, but something didn't feel right. Was it guilt, or was it something else? "Did you have any enemies? Any problems with anyone? Could this have been related to work or anything personal?" Tom looked away, avoiding her gaze for a moment. I don't think so. Susan and I didn't have any enemies. We had our disagreements, of course, but nothing like this. Everything was fine. Rachel noticed the hesitation in his voice. He was lying, or at least withholding something. She couldn't put her finger on it, but she knew it wasn't the whole truth. Where were you tonight, Mr. Langford? Rachel asked, leaning forward slightly. I need to know exactly where you were when your wife was killed. Tom seemed taken aback, but he quickly recovered. We went to dinner, the Oakwood Grill. We were there for a couple of hours. The staff can confirm that. Rachel nodded, writing down the information. The Oakwood Grill was a local upscale restaurant, a place where people like the Langfords often dined. Detective Rachel Adams had spent years solving cases, but the Langford case was different. There was a tension in the air that told her this wasn't a simple murder. The more she dug into the family's background, the more questions kept arising. The scene at the Langford house was too perfect, too neat, for something so violent to have occurred. She could feel the layers of lies and secrets waiting to be uncovered, and she was determined to peel them away one by one. The first thing Rachel did was speak to the restaurant staff. The Oakwood Grill was a popular spot in Hillcrest, frequented by locals and visitors alike. The staff confirmed that Tom and Susan Langford had been dining there that evening, but the timeline was a bit tricky. They arrived around 7 p.m. and stayed until just after 9 p.m. The manager confirmed that Tom had paid the bill and left with Susan. However, there was a small detail that caught Rachel's attention. The manager mentioned that Tom had seemed distracted during dinner, barely speaking to his wife. At one point, he was seen texting someone under the table, his phone held at an awkward angle. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Rachel's suspicion grow. Had Tom been involved in something he didn't want Susan to find out about? Was there someone else in his life? She needed more answers, and to get them, she had to go back to the house. After speaking with the staff, Rachel asked her team to review the security footage from the Oakwood Grill. The footage was grainy, but it was clear enough to show that Tom and Susan were alone at the table. Tom did look distracted, his eyes frequently darting to his phone. But what struck Rachel as odd was the absence of any meaningful interaction between the two. No touching, no conversation, just a distant couple. As Rachel left the restaurant, she felt a gnawing sense of unease. There was something deeper going on here, and she had a feeling that the key to unlocking this case lay in the Langford family home itself. Back at the house, Rachel's team had already begun processing the crime scene, collecting evidence and photographing the room. As Rachel entered the master bedroom, the cold weight of the situation settled over her once more. The bloodstains had been carefully documented, and the body had already been removed, but there was still so much left to piece together. Rachel walked over to the nightstand beside the bed and noticed something strange. There, tucked under a stack of papers, was a photograph of Tom and Susan. At first glance, it appeared to be a typical family photo, happy smiles, arms around each other. But something about it didn't sit right. It was taken recently, but it wasn't framed like most family photos. It was slightly crumpled, as if it had been handled roughly. Rachel picked it up and studied it closely. That's when she noticed it. There was a third person in the picture, a young woman sitting next to Tom, her arm around his waist. She wasn't a stranger. Rachel recognized her immediately. It was Holly, the babysitter. Rachel's blood ran cold. It all started to make sense. Holly had been a regular part of the Langford household, trusted with the children. She had always been around, and Tom had always been friendly with her, maybe too friendly. But this photo confirmed it. There was an affair. The question was, how deep did it go? Had Susan discovered the affair before she was murdered? Was that what triggered Tom to lash out? Rachel's mind raced as she picked up her phone and called for Holly to come in for questioning. She wasn't sure if Holly was directly involved in the murder, but the photo was a crucial piece of evidence. It was time to bring her in and get some answers. Holly sat nervously in the sterile interrogation room, her hands fidgeting in her lap. She was a young girl, just 16, but Rachel had learned long ago not to underestimate people based on their age. Holly had been a regular presence in the Langford home for months, and now Rachel needed to understand her role in all of this. She had been part of the family dynamic, but now it seemed like she was more deeply involved than anyone had suspected. When Rachel entered the room, she didn't waste time. She sat across from Holly and studied her for a moment, trying to read the girl's body language. Holly's eyes were wide, filled with fear and confusion. But Rachel could also sense something else: guilt. Holly wasn't telling the whole truth, and Rachel could see that. "Holly," Rachel began, her voice calm but firm, "I need you to tell me what happened the night Susan was killed. I need you to be completely honest with me." Holly swallowed hard, her throat dry. She hadn't expected to be pulled into this. She had been a babysitter, just trying to make some extra money, but now it seemed like everything had fallen apart. "I don't know what you want me to say," Holly replied softly, avoiding Rachel's gaze. Rachel leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing. Detective Rachel Adams left the interrogation room with a sinking feeling in her gut. Holly's confession, while shedding some light on the affair, didn't fully explain the murder. Holly had admitted to knowing about Tom's infidelity in the confrontation between Tom and Susan, but she wasn't completely forthcoming about her own involvement. Rachel needed to dig deeper, to see if Holly had been more involved than she was letting on. As she walked through the police station, Rachel mulled over everything she had learned so far. Tom Langford was clearly guilty of something. His behavior was too erratic, and the details he'd provided had been inconsistent. The affair with Holly was the obvious motive for Susan's murder, but there were still too many unanswered questions. What had truly set Tom off, and why had Holly been so involved? Rachel decided to visit the Langford house once more. She needed to re-examine the crime scene and speak to the rest of the family, particularly the children. She was well aware that in cases like these, there were often hidden details that could shift everything. No stone would be left unturned. When she arrived, the house felt eerily quiet. The officers who had been securing the scene were still there, but there was an unsettling stillness in the air. As Rachel entered the house, she noticed the photographs on the walls: family pictures, vacations, moments of happiness. To an outsider, the Langfords appeared to be the perfect family, and it was hard to imagine how such a tragedy could unfold behind these closed doors. But now everything had changed. Rachel walked upstairs to the master bedroom, the scene of the murder. She examined it again, looking for any detail she might have missed earlier. The bloodstains were still there, the room meticulously cleaned by the forensic team. Rachel's eyes lingered on the nightstand once more. The photograph of Tom, Susan, and Holly, taken with a warm smile, a complete family picture, now a cruel reminder of the lies and deceit. She had seen the same picture earlier, but something about it felt more important now. That was when she saw it, tucked into the corner of the nightstand drawer, hidden beneath a few loose papers, was a journal. Rachel's fingers trembled slightly as she pulled it out. The journal belonged to Susan Langford. Rachel opened it carefully, scanning the first few pages. Susan had written in it frequently, mostly mundane notes about her daily life. But as Rachel turned the pages, one entry caught her attention. "Tom hasn't been the same lately. He's distant. I found a text message on his phone. Something about meeting up with someone. I don't know who it is, but I have a bad feeling about it. I confronted him, but he just brushed it off. I can't shake the feeling that something is wrong. I think he's hiding something from me. I need to know what it is. I'm scared I'm losing him." Rachel's heart raced. The entry confirmed what she had already suspected. Susan had known something was off. She had confronted Tom, but he had denied everything. Rachel flipped through more pages, looking for any other hints that might explain why Susan had been so troubled. On October 25th, just a few days before her murder, Susan had written again. "I caught him. He didn't even try to deny it this time. He's been seeing her, the babysitter, Holly. I don't know what to do. I love Tom, but I can't live with the lies. I want to confront him, but I don't know how. I don't want to lose my family, but I can't forgive him for this." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. Holly had been the one Susan had found out about. The affair was far from a secret to Susan, and the last entry was chilling. It wasn't just the affair that was destroying the family. It was Tom's reaction to being caught. His fear of losing everything had already begun to fester, and it seemed he was willing to do anything to keep his secrets hidden. It was becoming clear to Rachel. The motive wasn't just about an affair, it was about control. Tom Langford had been living a double life, and when Susan threatened to expose him, he had snapped. But the involvement of Holly and her sudden appearance in the investigation added another layer of complexity. Rachel needed to know how Holly had gotten so entangled in this web. Rachel decided to bring Holly back in for questioning. The teenager's previous statements were concerning, but Rachel had a sense that Holly was still hiding something. The journal had provided crucial context, but Rachel needed to hear it from Holly herself. What had happened in the moments after Tom found out that Susan knew about the affair? This time, Rachel wasn't going to let Holly hide behind her innocence. She needed to get the full story. Holly looked more nervous than ever when she entered the interrogation room. She had changed her clothes since their last meeting, but the fear in her eyes was still evident. She sat down slowly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Detective Rachel Adams stood in front of the Langford house once again, watching as the sun began to set over the quiet suburban neighborhood. The tension of the past few days weighed heavily on her. With Holly's confession, the pieces of the puzzle had finally started to fit together, but the road to justice for Susan Langford was far from over. Tom Langford was guilty of his wife's murder. There was no doubt in Rachel's mind, but proving it would require more than just testimony and confessions. It would require solid evidence, a meticulous presentation in court, and, above all, a thorough understanding of the tangled web of lies that had led to Susan's tragic death. The next step was to prepare for the arrest. Tom Langford was still under suspicion, but Rachel needed to build a case strong enough to ensure a conviction. His initial story had been shaky, but now with Holly's involvement in the revelation of Susan's journal, it seemed clear that Tom had orchestrated the murder, with Holly playing a role in the cover-up. The affair, the confrontation, and the fear of losing everything had pushed Tom over the edge. But Rachel had to be sure. She needed evidence that would stand up in court. Rachel's team had already gathered the necessary evidence: Holly's confession, Susan's journal, and the timeline of events that showed Tom's strange behavior the night of the murder. Still, Rachel knew that nothing could be taken for granted. Tom had been careful, meticulous even, in covering his tracks. The fact that he hadn't immediately appeared guilty on the surface had made him all the more dangerous. But now they had enough to make an arrest. The decision was made. Rachel and her team arrived at the Langford house early in the morning, just as Tom was getting ready to leave for work. He looked surprised when the officers approached him, but there was no denying the gravity of the situation. Rachel could see the realization dawning in his eyes as they read him his rights. "Tom Langford," Rachel said, her voice steady, "you're under arrest for the murder of your wife, Susan Langford. You have the right to remain silent." Tom's face turned pale, but he didn't resist. He stood there for a moment, his mind racing, and then he nodded. "I understand," he muttered, his voice low and strained. "I've been waiting for this." Back at the station, Rachel led Tom into an interrogation room. He had been quiet during the drive over, but now sitting in front of Rachel, the weight of the situation seemed to hit him all at once. He looked tired, defeated, like a man who knew the truth had finally caught up with him. Rachel sat across from him, folding her arms. She didn't speak for a few moments, letting the silence stretch between them. She knew Tom was trying to gather his thoughts, trying to figure out what to say, but Rachel had no intention of letting him control this conversation. "You've been caught, Tom," Rachel said, her voice calm but firm. "We have everything we need. Holly's confession, Susan's journal, the evidence. The truth is out now. There's no way for you to hide anymore." Tom stared at the table in front of him, his fingers twitching nervously. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "I didn't want to kill her." Rachel leaned forward slightly, narrowing her eyes. "But you did, Tom. You killed her, and you had help. Holly helped you cover it up." Tom's eyes darted up to meet hers, his expression momentarily hardening. "You don't understand," he said, his voice rising. "I didn't want to lose everything. My family, my life, everything I built. Susan was going to ruin it all. She was going to expose me, and I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't lose her, but I also couldn't let her take everything away." Rachel sat back, studying him. She had heard this kind of justification before, manipulative, self-serving rationalizations that tried to paint the killer as the victim. But she wasn't about to buy into it. You didn't just kill her because of the affair, Tom. You killed her because she threatened everything you had. You were willing to do anything to keep your secret safe. And now, look where we are. Tom was quiet for a long moment, his eyes flickering with a mix of guilt and frustration. Finally, he spoke again, his voice soft. I never meant for her to die. I just wanted her to leave me alone. But when she confronted me, when she said she knew about Holly, I just lost it. I couldn't think straight. I was so afraid. Everything was falling apart. Rachel's eyes narrowed. So you killed her in a fit of rage. You stabbed her over and over. Just like that. Tom's face twisted in anguish. I didn't mean to. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. But when I saw the look on her face, I knew it was over. I had to make sure she wouldn't tell anyone. I couldn't let her destroy everything. Detective Rachel Adams sat at her desk, staring at the stack of paperwork before her. The Langford case had finally come to an end, but the weight of everything that had transpired was still heavy on her shoulders. She had seen plenty of murders in her career, but there was something uniquely heartbreaking about this one. The Langfords, once seen as the perfect family in their small suburban town, had been torn apart by lies, betrayal, and ultimately, murder. The verdict had been handed down, and Tom Langford had been sentenced to life in prison. Holly, the 16-year-old girl who had been manipulated by Tom, was facing a lesser sentence. But neither of them would ever be the same again. And neither would the community. Hillcrest was a quiet town, known for its tight-knit community and family values. The Langfords had fit perfectly into that image. Tom's job as a corporate executive, Susan's role as a stay-at-home mother, and their 3 children had made them the ideal family. They attended church on Sundays, volunteered at local events, and were involved in the schools. Their lives from the outside appeared perfect. But the murder had shattered that illusion. The people of Hillcrest were still trying to come to terms with the tragedy. How could something so horrific happen in their peaceful town? Susan Langford's death had rocked the community to its core. Friends and neighbors who had once admired the Langfords now questioned everything they thought they knew about them. The perfect family was a lie, and that realization left many feeling betrayed. Rachel had received several calls from local residents since the trial, most of them expressing disbelief. Some still couldn't wrap their minds around the fact that Tom, the man they had known as a loving husband and father, was capable of such a horrific crime. Others expressed their anger, especially towards Holly, who had been an innocent bystander at first, but had become complicit in the cover-up. Even the Langford children, though young, had been affected by the scandal. Susan's murder had left a permanent mark on them. They were placed in foster care, away from the town that had known them as the children of the Langfords. It was unclear whether they would ever recover from the trauma of losing both parents, one to murder and the other to prison. As Rachel watched the aftermath unfold from the safety of her office, she couldn't help but feel a sense of sadness. The case was closed, but the consequences would ripple through the town for years to come. Rachel couldn't forget about Holly. The girl was just 16, and though she had played a role in the crime, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that Holly had been a victim too. She had been seduced and manipulated by Tom, a man in his 40s, who had taken advantage of her youth and vulnerability. Holly hadn't had the maturity or life experience to make the right choices, and in the end, her actions had cost her much more than she could have imagined. The juvenile court had sentenced Holly to 5 years in a juvenile detention center, a sentence that was met with mixed reactions. Some felt she deserved the time in detention for her role in helping cover up the murder. Others felt that given her age and the circumstances, she deserved a second chance. Rachel had visited Holly before the trial ended, wanting to make sure the girl understood the gravity of what had happened. Their conversation had been difficult. Holly was still so young, but she had taken responsibility for her actions, even if her understanding of everything that had transpired was clouded by her guilt and fear. She admitted that she had been scared of Tom and the power he had over her. But Rachel knew that Holly had also made the choice to go along with his plan. That made her complicit, even if she was a victim in her own right. "I never thought it would get this bad," Holly had told Rachel during their final conversation in the juvenile center. "I just wanted to be with him. I didn't want her dead." Rachel could see the shame in Holly's eyes, but she knew it wasn't just guilt. It was the weight of realizing how much she had lost. Holly's future was uncertain. The next 5 years would shape her life, but Rachel wasn't sure if that would be enough to heal the wounds she had inflicted on herself. Tom Langford's life had changed forever. The man who had once held power and control over his family and his community was now just another prisoner behind bars. His days of luxury, of running his corporate empire, were over. In prison, he would be faced with the harsh reality of what he had done. His prison sentence was life, without the possibility of parole. As Tom sat in his cell, he thought about the choices he had made, choices that had led to the destruction of his family, his marriage, and ultimately his own freedom. The affair with Holly had been the catalyst, but the fear of losing everything had driven him to murder. Tom had thought he could escape the consequences, but in the end, there was no escaping the truth. The prison guards told Rachel that Tom kept to himself, refusing to interact with anyone. His pride, the thing that had once made him so confident and manipulative, had been shattered. He was alone now, and Rachel couldn't help but wonder if he truly understood the depth of what he had done. Was he remorseful, or was he still just a man trying to justify his actions? She didn't think Tom would ever find peace, not in prison, and certainly not in his own mind. The murder of Susan Langford had not only destroyed her life, it had destroyed his. Back in her office, Rachel took a moment to reflect. The Langford case had been one of the most challenging of her career. She had seen the darker side of human nature, how jealousy, greed, and fear could drive a person to commit the most horrific acts. But she had also seen the strength of the truth. She had stayed determined, even when the case seemed like it might slip away. She had seen the lies unravel, piece by piece, and she had made sure that justice was served. Still, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness that lingered after the trial. She had done her job, and the right people had been held accountable. But there was something about the case that still haunted her. The destruction of the Langford family, the devastation to their children, the manipulation of a young girl like Holly. It left a bitter taste in her mouth. No one truly won here. Rachel glanced at the framed picture on her desk, her own family, the people she loved. She reminded herself of the importance of holding on to that, the ones she cared about, and the integrity of her work. As much as cases like the Langfords took from her, they also reminded her why she chose this career in the first place: to bring truth to light, to protect the vulnerable, and to give victims the justice they deserved. Though the Langford case was over, Rachel knew she had more work ahead of her. There would always be another case, another victim, another truth to uncover, and she would be there, ready to face it head on. As she gathered her things and left the station, Rachel stepped into the cool evening air. The case was closed, but the lessons from the Langford tragedy would stay with her forever.